So next in part 4, we're going to talk about integrated pest management, which is often abbreviated to IPM. So we're going to go over a brief introduction to IPM. We're going to talk about using the UC IPM website for key pests in fruit orchards and fruit trees. And we'll talk about some examples with common pests that I've seen and heard a lot about in our region. And I will share some current research that I've been involved with in Sonoma County. So to begin with, what is a pest? So really broadly speaking, a pest is any unwanted organism that damages or interferes with plants that we care about, in this case, fruit trees. So usually when people use the term pest, the first thing people tend to think about are insect pests, such as codling moth, that's pictured here, which causes a lot of issues in apple trees and pear trees. But pests also include a lot of other different types of organisms, including weeds such as thistle, different types of pathogens, which are microbes such as bacteria, fungi, or viruses. And one example pictured here is branch canker. So this is caused by a variety of different types of fungal pathogens. And pests can also include vertebrates like rodents like gophers, which we have a lot in Sonoma County. So then what is IPM? IPM stands for Integrated Pest Management, as I mentioned. So it's integrated because we combine multiple strategies together and we're not going to rely on just one strategy or one tactic. And the goal here really is to manage pest populations and keep the damage under your threshold. So, for you, it's backyard grower, or the folks that you're talking with, that might be, different depending on different people's goals. But the point is that we want to keep it under whatever threshold meets your goals. So integrated pest management is very effective because it is a big picture ecosystem-based approach to solving pest problems. So there's this emphasis on long-term pest prevention, first and foremost. And this really is a toolbox approach. So you're going to select the tools or strategies that make sense for your unique context. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, but there are some recommendations. So within this IPM framework, you're really only going to use pesticides after monitoring indicates that they're actually needed, and of course, always following the label directions. You're going to use strategies to minimize risks to non-target organisms. And, thinking about all of these different strategies in your toolbox, typically IPM has been thought of sort of is in this hierarchical triangle format. So this is pretty common, in terms of how historically we thought about IPM. So in this representation of IPM, you would start at the bottom with identification and understanding your pest first and foremost, which is really important. And then you can explore cultural controls, sanitation, physical and mechanical strategies, biological strategies, and then only if you really need them, looking at chemical strategies. And at the same time, especially more recently, we've seen different representations visually of IPM, and now we're seeing a lot more kind of cycles or circular representations where we kind of are doing a lot of these things in a cycle and repeatedly. So starting with ID, going into monitoring, keeping records, taking action, seeing how it goes, evaluating how it went, whether it helped keep pest levels under your threshold, inspecting the damage, inspecting, where the pests are, how many, and just repeating this cycle and reevaluating your approach. So it's being more of a process. So the idea here with this, similar with nutrient management, we want to be responsive and integrated and not prescriptive. So, really responding to what you're seeing, what you're observing, what's working, what's not working, and adjusting your IPM approach from there. So like I mentioned, you want to start here with inspection. So just making sure that you're out looking at your tree or trees on a regular basis. You want to correctly identify the pest. So if you think something might be a pest, start by making sure through identification. Then you want to scout and keep records over time, monitoring, seeing how things are going, how fast their population levels might be changing, You want to consult resources and choose actions appropriately, assess whether those actions really worked using your thresholds, and then really reevaluating and refining your approach over time to make sure that you're getting the level of pest control that you want. So here's some examples of IPM strategies in your toolbox. Choosing resistant crop varieties. Again, we're talking about genetics and thoughtfully, strategically choosing um, genetics that work for your goals in your region. And, this is a great example where we do have quite a bit of peach leaf curl, which is a disease in Sonoma County and in our region more broadly. So the good news is there are some peach varieties that are resistant and are still great, in quality and flavor and everything. But Frost is a great peach variety that does have resistance to peach leaf curl. So it's worth exploring, what are the big pests in my region? And before I go out and choose a type of tree, what kind of genetics should I be looking for? Maybe that's resistance to certain pests. Another great example of your IPM toolbox is routine scanning for pests. So there's different types of traps out there. Here's an example with sticky traps. It's a great way to just keep an eye on pest levels, insect pest levels, as they might change over time. Some more examples, there's all kinds of cultural practices out there, but one of them is sanitation. So removing debris from an orchard is important to make sure that you're not harboring pathogens that could, infect nearby healthy plants. Another one is biological control. So great example here is installing raptor perches to encourage gopher predation. This of course is more of a long-term strategy. It's not going to change, your gopher levels overnight, but just making sure that different types of raptors have a favorable environment and that you would attract them to your area, your backyard, is helpful. And sometimes, you might already have an owl box on site. That's great. Stuff like that. Anything you can do to encourage natural predators can be helpful in the long run. So there's a lot of really good resources out there to help you with identification and all of the other steps within the IPM framework. So I pasted a couple of them here. We have, just IPM, ucnr.edu. What is IPM? Excellent place to start, just defining IPM. There's also the Home Orchard website that has, pest and disease info. But, if you just want a simple place to start, you can just go directly to the UC IPM website and select a category. So let's say we chose home, garden, turf, landscape pests. You click on this box, and then you have a bunch of different options to choose from. So I scroll down to fruit trees since that's our topic today. And then if you go to that website, you have a lot of different types of fruit trees. So let's say we go with apples for the sake of an example, since they are pretty common in our region. You choose the crop type and then look at the page for that crop, and you see all kinds of different examples of common pests. So this is really helpful. You can look through invertebrates, diseases. It also includes environmental disorders, which is helpful. But there are also lots of helpful tips around, fertilizing, pruning, thinning, etc. So this is a great website. It can really help you with that identification component. Because, let's say we chose European canker, for instance, then we would go to a new site where we see really helpful photos of the pest. And in this case, it's a disease. How do you identify it? What do you look for? What's its life cycle? Understanding its biology is important because that influences how we manage it effectively. Also, I didn't paste the whole site because it's long, but there's also sections about damage. How do you identify the damage? And really, helping you think through all of these different IPM strategies and decide which makes sense in the specific situation at hand. So cannot recommend this website enough. Highly recommend you just explore it, especially for common fruit tree types and also common pests that you're pretty likely to encounter. And if nothing else, the photos are excellent. It can help you at least with identification. You can always come back to this website for more information about specific strategies. In addition, I wanted to mention at that main UC IPM website, there is another section for agricultural pests and for other environments as well. But I use the agricultural pest section a lot with my role as a specialty crops advisor because I work with commercial growers, but there is some additional information occasionally that can be useful. If you read through the home garden, turf, and landscape pests, and you want more information, you can always check here too. So that's just so you know it's out there. Not quite as relevant for you as that first square though. Okay, so now we're going to get into some examples of common pests in our region. So rodents are really prevalent, especially gophers. In apples and pears, we have got branch canker pathogen, we have fire blight in some cases, which you can see here on the top right corner. In olives, we've got olive fruit fly, it's pretty prevalent. In peaches and plums, peach leaf curl is very common, unfortunately. And thankfully, we haven't found this yet, but I wanted to put it here because it has been found in Marin County. So really, this is not a common pest, but I just wanted to include it as an example of how pests can move around especially with shifting climates. That's something to have on your radar. So just as an example, of how this can happen, I want to talk a little bit about Asian citrus psyllid. So this is a small insect with mottled brown wings, produces this visible waxy deposits that direct honeydew away from their bodies, and they vector a pathogen that causes Huanglongbing disease, which severely damages citrus trees. And again, we have not found this yet in Sonoma County, thankfully, but it is moving, and the quarantine zone has been expanded to include Marin. So it's just something to be aware of and to know what this looks like and the name and where to find more information. So Huanglongbing disease, there should be an N in that word, but HLB in citrus, this is also known as citrus greening. It's a serious threat to citrus trees worldwide, unfortunately. And I just want to mention symptoms so it's on everyone's radar before we get more into pests that we do have in Sonoma County. Save that for a little bit later. So symptoms of this disease include yellow shoots with pale green and yellow flushes. So this is going to be less uniform than your typical nitrogen deficiency. You will see asymmetrically mottled and leathery leaves. And mottled that's a really nice way to describe what we see with the yellowing in this photo here. I would call that yellow, that sort of yellow patchiness mottled. You'd see misshaped fruit showing color inversions from yellow to orange to green on the peduncle side, but it's green on the other side. And there's tons of really good photos of all of this on the UC IPM webpage. And like I mentioned, the quarantine zone is expanding, unfortunately. This is a map from the USDA showing that it's just something to have on our radar. So monitoring is important. We want to inspect citrus trees and report any infestations of the Asian citrus psyllid to the Ag Commissioner's office. You want to control ants in general for a lot of reasons, but also because they farm psyllid honeydew and protect the psyllids against biological predators. And there are a number of biocontrol predators out there, parasites and predators that feed on Asian citrus psyllid, such as parasitoid wasps. And there are chemical control options. So home gardeners can hire a landscape professional or apply an appropriate insecticide themselves. Again, lots more info on this out there. Okay, so now moving into common examples that we do see a lot in our region. Peach leaf curl is a big one. So this is a disease caused by Tephrinia deformans, which is a fungal plant pathogen. It overwinters on branches in peach trees, and the spores are dispersed by rain. The leaf symptoms really start to appear around 2 weeks after leaves emerge from the buds in the spring. So, as we move towards spring, this is just something to have on your radar. It tends to start as like reddish pink areas on developing leaves, like you can see in this photo here. Also, I included a photo of Tephrinia deformans spores because I think they're really fascinating. And so these get dispersed by rain, like I mentioned, from leaf to leaf. So then as symptoms begin to develop a little bit more, you're going to see leaf deformation. In really severe cases, you're going to see a lot of defoliation, reduced yield, and ultimately stunted tree growth. I think especially in combination with other stressors, this can definitely kill trees. So it's just something to be aware of. Thankfully, there are some resistant varieties, like I mentioned earlier, including frost. There's also other ones like Indian Free, Muir, and Q18, probably quite a few other ones out there. Those are just examples. It's worth noting that removing disease leaves isn't going to do much for control of peach leaf curl. So you could reduce, you could thin the fruit out to reduce the demand on the plant. So that could help because the plant's really stressed. So if you thin the fruit out a little bit, that could sort of help reduce the demand on the plant to fulfill all of the needs of those fruit. Really, I think it makes sense to focus a lot on dormant pruning prior to fungicide application to remove inoculum. And these dormant fungicide sprays, can include all kinds of different fixed copper products. There's a lot of options out there, but generally you want to apply after the leaves have fallen. Typically, a single early treatment tends to be effective, but if you have really high rainfall or if you just have a really severely infected tree, you might want to consider applying a second spray at flower bud development right before green leaf tips begin to be visible. So moving on to codling moth in apples as another example, this is an insect pest that affects apples and pears and walnuts as well. But codling moths tunnel into fruit and damage it and leave frass, as you can see in this photo here. And wormy fruit, unfortunately, can contain aflatoxin from the mold that occurs there. And aflatoxin is a dangerous human health risk. So that's something to be aware of. So, like I mentioned earlier, it's really helpful to understand the life cycle of different pests. So, larvae overwinter in cocoons under the bark and soil and debris, and then they pupate in those cocoons and emerge as adult moths in the early spring. They deposit eggs on fruit, leaves, and branches, and the young larvae bore into fruit and complete development there in the fruit. Then they drop to the soil under the tree to search for a pupation site, and they can have 2 to 4 generations per year. So here's what they look like for the larvae at the top and the adult moths on the bottom. So for management options for codling moth, again, you do have some options when it comes to genetics. So you might want to think about varieties that mature early. So that means that you're going to get the fruit out of the orchard earlier, which means they'll be a little bit less susceptible. You might see lower damage just because you're removing the fruit sooner than later. You also want to think about sanitation. So this means regularly removing and destroying infested fruit. You could put bags on fruit, especially if you just have, a couple trees and it's not too labor intensive. That can provide some level of physical protection. Trapping can help you monitor codling moth populations and how they change over time, but trapping really isn't going to reduce populations in a meaningful way, so just bear that in mind. Trunk banding, so this essentially traps mature larvae in a cardboard band as they climb the trunk. Insecticides include different spinosad products. Monitoring, in proper timing, of course, is critical for any insecticide product. And spinosad is just an example that happens to be organic. So moving on to another pest. So branch canker on apple is pretty prevalent issue I've seen a lot in apple trees in our region. So I took all of these photos myself. They cause a lot of different symptoms that we're going to get into. So branch canker on apple is caused by actually quite a few different fungal pathogens. So here are just a couple examples: Diplodia species, Neonectria major, etc. So branch canker is basically brown lesions on branches. So as you can see in these photos, we've got some dead branch tissue that shows up as these, dark patches of bark on branches. And this can cause branch dieback. Unfortunately, the wood tissue under these lesions is reddish brown, water soaked looking. And these lesions grow into cankers over time that just get bigger and bigger steadily. Fortunately, this doesn't progress nearly as fast as fire blight does, but it still progresses quickly enough to solve problems if you don't catch it early. So with branch canker, these cankers become elliptical and sunken if you let them go for too long, and they cause concentric calluses, which I think is really interesting. We see, if you slice it open, On the far left side, you can see these sort of water-soaked areas and concentric rings. You also see concentric rings on the outside of the tissue as well, where, in these photo in the middle and the far right, we see how this pathogen is progressing over time. So each one of these rings represents a new step for that pathogen across the plant tissue, which is pretty fascinating, but unfortunately can cause quite a bit of damage. So again, thinking about life cycles so we can effectively understand and manage the pest. So these pathogens overwinter on dead branches. Their spores spread during rainfall, dew, and fog. They land on fresh leaf scars, pruning wounds, broken branches, and they colonize exposed plant tissue. So here's what these spores look like. This is from Dr. Karina Elfar, UC Davis, who I've worked with on this subject quite a bit. I think these are really fascinating photos and just illustrate what the spores of these diseases can look like. So thinking about management, we want to make sure we're scouting on a regular basis and catching this issue early. You want to make sure you're pruning out cankers on branches. So this is different than architectural pruning. Here now we actually have a different goal where we're identifying these cankers and we're getting rid of them. So we want to cut them out and make sure that we move them out of the orchard. So I would say, based on recommendations from Karina and Akif Escalon, who's UC Cooperative Extension plant pathology expert for fruit, who's worked on this. So they recommend pruning out these cankers in early summer because at that point, the disease spread is less likely. They can be a little bit harder to see at that point in time, but you can always flag branches or flag, specific trees with a little flagging tape or other markers so you know where you want to come back to. And the disease is less likely since it's drier at that time of year. So you're going to remove the dead branches a few inches below that canker tissue. You want to cut until you see clean tissue. And, and you also want to make sure, as much as you can, not to leave stubs. So if you can cut flush to the next branch, that's great. It's not always possible, but it helps. And you want to make sure you're sanitizing your pruning tools between every cut if you can. And especially for the backyard context, that's much more doable and less labor intensive than on larger orchards. So highly, highly recommend sanitize your pruning tools to reduce spread of pathogens between each cut. So this just means a 70% isopropyl alcohol mixture. Here's an example of how I do this. I just get a little spray bottle, do 70% isopropyl alcohol, and the rest is water. So like I mentioned, you want to make sure you remove your pruning debris out of the orchard immediately as soon as possible. Don't let them sit in piles in the orchard for too long, ideally same day if you can. So the reason for this is the inoculum can spread from piles on orchard floor to healthy trees. So highly recommend getting that disease material out of the orchard as soon as possible. So considering other options, you can use biologically based pruning wound protectants to compete with and exclude plant pathogens. So, there's a lot of examples out there. Again, no official endorsements, but, there's Mycosop, which is OMRI listed, which means it's organic. There's also some conventional or synthetic products like Vitaseal and Beloc. So these are not sealants. So a sealant is a paint that acts as like a physical barrier to exclude microbes. These are actually alive. So these products contain beneficial microbes. Trichoderma is a great example of that. And these microbes compete with pathogen microbes on the pruning wound surface. So this is, an emerging option. There's not a ton of options out there on the market right now, but hopefully there will be more in the future. So again, I just want to, bring everyone's attention back to the UC IPM website. I have my own website as well that has a lot of different IPM resources, including a write-up on this disease, but you can also find, similar diseases like European canker, which is caused by Neonectria major, on the UC IPM website. But I just wanted to highlight this part briefly because it points to our region. So the UC IPM website is telling us that the fungus survives in bark cankers, produces spores that enter, leaf scars during rains, and One helpful thing, that you'll see on these websites is that they might talk about varieties. So some varieties are more susceptible than others. Delicious in this case, it sounds like the most susceptible one, followed by Gravenstein and Rome Beauty. And unfortunately, they mentioned that this disease is worse in the Sebastopol area of Sonoma County in years with prolonged fall rains, which we've been getting this year and last year. So just another common pest to keep your eye out for in our region. And I'm going to describe a little bit about the current research that I'm working on with Akif Escalon and Karina Alfar, who I mentioned earlier. They're plant pathologists at UC Davis. So Karina works with Akif. She's in his lab as a postdoc. So they isolated the pathogens that cause apple branch canker from samples from an apple orchard close to Sebastopol. And these pathogens actually included a couple pathogens that we have not found yet in the United States, including Diplodia seriata and Diplodia bulgarca. So they're the first scientists in the United States to find these pathogens in apples in our region. And so then from there, they visited and collected samples to explore this further and just really confirm that this is what we're working with. So they came out, they took some samples. We talked with people about what this potentially could mean and also how to manage it effectively. And then here's a photo of Karina here. She and Carlos, another person in their lab, installed a field trial in an apple orchard in our region last June to verify these pathogens are actually here and that they cause the disease symptoms that we're seeing. So folks from this lab confirmed Diplodia bulgarca presence and published a first report for California late last year. I'm a co-author on that, and if you really want to dive into this, it's open access. Anyone can read it. There's some really cool photos. Yeah, this is kind of supplemental. This may be more information than you need, but I think it's, just a great example of how there's diseases out there and pests out there that we're still learning about. And I feel really lucky to get to collaborate with scientists at UC Davis on this. So yeah, I feel lucky I get to work with some experts on these subjects. And so from there, we had a webinar on apple branch canker management to convey this information, but also talk about IPM. So in December last year, Karina shared her research results, and together we presented IPM strategies for apple branch canker pathogens. So this is sort of your toolbox for this issue. This webinar was recorded, and you can find it on my YouTube channel, where I put all my recordings from webinars and virtual events. So just briefly a little bit about feedback. So this event was for commercial and Master Gardener attendees. So the people who filled out the evaluation survey reported that the knowledge that they gained will help them improve their IPM practices in orchard health. Everyone who filled out the survey reported they'll use the knowledge gained to manage apple branch canker in a more sustainable and effective way. And we got a lot of really great qualitative feedback too, hoping to see more of these types of events. So just to circle back around to IPM, thinking about it in a big picture sense, just bear in mind that it's a process and, stick with it and make sure you reach out and look at the resources online, talk to each other, reach out to master gardeners who have a lot of experience with this. There's a lot of knowledge in this group, so I just highly encourage folks to remember it's a process and take good notes and see how different strategies work in different contexts. So just to summarize everything, thinking about active management, like I mentioned to begin, we have so many different things to think about when it comes to thoughtfully, proactively managing fruit trees. But I just wanted to point out that good plant health, due to all of these other things, makes IPM easier. So that's the good news. If you are pruning and thinning effectively, if you chose strategic cultivars and fruit tree types, you planned your orchard or even just your one tree where it would go strategically, you're making sure it's getting enough water but not too much, enough nutrients but not too much, you're implementing soil health building practices, you've got good sunburn and frost protection. All of these things mean your trees are going to be healthier, and that means they will be more resilient and better equipped to handle pest pressure. So that's the good news. And also, this helps promote regional crop system and ecosystem health too. So, once you really get a good IPM approach in place, it's not only good for you, but it's good for your neighbors because you're not harboring unwanted pests. It's also good for our regional ecosystem at a larger scale as well. And, similar to what I was saying about soil health earlier, these are all interconnected, overlapping. It's easy to present them in these different sections, but ultimately in the real world, they interact with each other. They all affect tree health, yield, your fruit production, and the ecosystem around you. So you just want to make sure you're responding to what you observe at your site, since there are a lot of interactions and a lot of variability between different sites. So one more word about resources. The Fruit and Nut Research Information Center at UC Davis has a really great 5-day course in March each year if you're interested. So if you really want to dive into it, not necessary, but if you're interested in going this route, there are a lot of great trainings out there, and this is one of them. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and please let me know if you have any questions.